Well, I guess we're in the era of the pandemic. This is a big event for society, and uh, practically everything in society appears to me to be affected by it. I've given a lot of thought to what is happening, and this event has, in a sense, kind of dovetailed with a lot of my previous research in trying to understand the entire power matrix of society and why society operates the way it does, etc. And so I would like to give, in this short presentation, a bit of an overview of my own thinking as it has proceeded along the lines of trying to understand what is this event, this COVID-19? Because when I first heard about, when it first started entering the news and I read the media reports on what was happening, it didn't really add up to me. And of course, nothing in the public domain, for me, really adds up, because I think basically the entire public domain is the domain of operations of people who use information in ways that are advantageous to them, and it has not necessarily a regard for simply what's true. And for my part, I just want to know what's true. So COVID-19, let's draw a context to give some kind of contextual understanding of what's happening out there, at least so far as the way I see things. Back in 2008, the financial system suffered a major blow and basically imploded to an extent that it never had before. And that was very significant. It was, I remember watching some newscasts and seeing some of the political leaders in those newscasts actually fearful, wondering kind of WTF had happened. And they were clearly had their backs put up against the wall from that event. And that event very clearly, in my opinion, showed that the financial system had reached a certain kind of termination point. So this is kind of like context number one, that back in 2008, the financial system crashed. And it crashed because it's basically it's a debt-based system. Which means it's a Ponzi system, which means it has to grow every year. It has to get bigger. The entire amount of money in the economy has to grow. The number of people trading using that money has to grow. The number of products for which that money is traded has to grow. Everything has to grow. It's a growth-based, in other words, a debt-based system. And what happened back in 2008 was that world growth had reached a point where it was insufficient to further sustain any further growth of that entire system on a net basis, on basically a net or an average basis. Sure, there were and there remain kind of pockets around the earth where you can see some economic growth, and let's say China's still growing, and most of the developing world is still growing. But so far as kind of like the big contenders in the economy were concerned, the economy had reached a saturation point. And so given that, the financial system at a foundational, fundamental level could not be sustained. So it crashed. And the first thing, they had to do was, of course, sustain the system as it was, even though it was in this tattered state. They had to inject a whole bunch of money, trillions of dollars, into the economy to kind of put the financial system on a life support basis, to make sure that we still can have financial activity supporting all of our economic transactions and desires and whatnot. So they injected all this money, and in the years that followed, they tried to get growth back again. They tried to, they were putting all this basically free money into the economy, and that was having some effect. That people could go to the bank or down some chain of lending basically, and get money for, let's say, a business idea that they would have, And money was cheap. It was, anywhere from 1 to 0% interest, and sometimes it was even negative in certain parts of the world. And all of that money started entering the economy, and there was perhaps a little bit of growth attributable to that, but that amount of growth still was insufficient to do what kind of magic the banks wanted, which was, in essence, to reignite inflation. And if you follow the financial news of the last 10 years, you will see this constant concern for how can we get inflation back into economic functioning? Because inflation, in monetary terms, represents growth. It means the whole system is still growing. And I could give it, let's say, an illustration of why that growth is necessary. So somebody, we'll call him Joe, goes to the bank and gets $100. He gets a loan. Every dollar in circulation, every form of money in circulation derives from money printing at the central bank. It's basically reserve currency, and it's a reserve note that you hold in your hand when you hold a dollar in your hand. And if Joe goes to the bank, gets $100, let's say on 5% interest, he's going to have to pay $105 back in total, basically $5 interest on that debt at the end of the year. And so to pay that $5 interest, he has to go out and he has to earn some money. So he has to go to work and he has to do whatever he has to do at work to create a product or a service that he's going to sell for some profit and get some money so that he can get that $5 and pay it back to the bank. Now, the person who paid him the money for the service or the good had to pay with money, of course, that derives itself from this debt-based system as itself debt. And so that person then needs to go earn a bunch of money in order to kind of pay his debt back. And you can see that cycle kind of occurs through the entire community of people using the system, whereby in the way that it needs to operate to get to every next day, there has to be some actual growth taking place so that the entire system can keep circulating the money in the way that it circulates it using debt as the basis. So when there is no growth or insufficient growth, Joe has $5 to pay and he can only pay $4, so he's in default. And that default portends basically the death of the system if it's a systemic default, which is what happened in 2008. So the banks after that time, like I said, tried to raise inflation, and concomitantly with that, they wanted to raise interest rates at the banks. And they tried in this sector and they tried in that sector to get growth going, and they failed every time. So each time they tried to raise interest rates, the economy, in whichever economy it was, the Canadian economy, American economy, the UK economy, wherever, would stall. And so they failed again. So even with all this free money floating around in the system, and even though they tried through various measures, including getting governments online with various kinds of programs to get a little more growth going and to get a little more inflation back, or some inflation back into the system, they failed. And so we had a decade basically of failure, including a decade of free money. And that free money basically went into all the asset classes and basically caused them to get into bubble territory, which is kind of where we're at. So everything, largely speaking, is in bubble territory. And so that's a big problem. That kind of problem is a do or die kind of problem. And if it doesn't get fixed, the whole system collapses. And if the whole system collapses, we lose our economic functioning and basically our society. So it's that serious. So given that the financial system has tried but failed to solve this fundamental foundational problem through Plan A and Plan B, they have come to a point, I believe, where now they have to institute Plan C. And Plan C, as I see it, is COVID-19. And again, for a problem that is that enormous, that we stand to lose civilization if we don't fix this problem with the financial system. For a problem that is that enormous, there are degrees of foresight and oversight occurring within the system where an enormous amount of planning has been done and is being done to fix that problem. And the planning, I believe, that has been done came up with a solution that said, well, listen, there is essentially one area in the economy that has some significant potential for growth. And that area is, of course, the whole tech area with information, including anything that can be attributed to the internet and online interacting and online information flows, etc. That is an area that has potential. The internet has only been around since year 2000, or thereabouts, a little bit before. And because of that, it seems to me that the central banks, and we could just call the central banks Rothschild, Rothschild made an agreement with big tech that, well, what we can do, perhaps, to get some growth back is we can institute this thing called the lockdown. And the lockdown is going to have the effect of, first of all, it's going to have the effect of kind of lessening a bit of the pressure that's been building in the kind of the bubble chambers because the economic activity is going to slow down a bit for a while. And what's also going to happen then is that with the lockdown, there's, I think the understanding is that part of the economy will be crushed over here, and that potential will be let loose over here, which is the tech sector. So that sectors that are targeted for this so-called crushing, they would include, let's say, the real estate sectors, commercial real estate, malls, and anything that could be possibly transitioned into an online mode, including schools, all sorts of, let's say, office work has been kind of hived off to homework now, where people are working from home rather than working in offices. The entire oil sector is being attacked through this mechanism, because the oil business is part of that old kind of industrial kind of economy that is basically saturated in terms of growth. It's part of that, and so there's going to be, like, flights are going to be restricted, and commuting will be restricted through people working at home and whatnot, so that basically the old economy, in its kind of like, in certain kind of important industrial elements of it, targeted for being crushed, and that potential is going to migrate over to the tech community, which is going to be this kind of like increased role for computers and information in our lives, and that has potential to grow. Now we could ask, let's say from a broader context, and this could be context point number 2. Why does the tech sector have that potential, and is there some kind of understanding that can give us a sense of why the central banks would do as they do, as I think they have done, which is to basically agree with this single sector in society to work against other sectors in order to favor this sector, in order that the banks can get some growth back. The reason, I think, is that the tech sector represents the collective element in society. It's a kind of a collectivist orientation, so that if you ask kind of like, how does the tech sector work? Well, it works using information, and that information is basically information from people, and it includes transactional information. It includes people interacting in social contexts. It includes people sharing information. It includes businesses and entities sharing information. All of which is basically represents a kind of a collective element of society. That collective element has been, we could say, subject to decades of suppression and repression by what has been, in essence, the success of the kind of like the capitalist industries, who basically, through the success and progress of those industries became monopolized through various monopolists, people like Rockefeller, et cetera, where those industries, because they were so successful and because they were providing what was in essence the survival function of the species, in terms of providing the basic supply chains and the basic goods and the food and whatever else that go into making for a life that can actually survive on this planet. They got there first, and they got there, and with their success they were able to basically by the politicians and by the military, and they basically owned the entire world in that sense. And because their power was so great, these owners of capital were able to quite successfully suppress and repress the collectivist element, which was basically the people. And so the people kind of took a consolation prize on this planet, and that became known in political terminology as either socialism or communism. And as communism, for instance, they took consolation prizes of geographies that were less developed and so on. The net effect of which was a form of suppression of what is an equal element in our entire economy, which is if you don't, you can have goods and services, but if you don't have the people who are transacting those goods and services, well, you don't have an economy. And so necessarily implied by any factor of production is somebody on acting as a consumer of that production. And so this suppression of the collectivist element is now, I believe, starting to be rebalanced, and it, I think, will be rebalanced in its totality, so that we have basically an equal polarity between information on the one hand, industry, which could be called matter or energy, on the other hand, where in that rebalancing, the tech community has some growth potential in it, and I think that's a proper context for understanding, kind of a broader context for understanding why a central bank, which has fundamentally worldwide operations, would in my proposition agree with just one sector in society, which is it's a big sector. The tech and information is fully half of what our reality is in terms of our social and economic functioning. But all the same, it's just one part of what is a greater whole. And you have this kind of world-ranging financial system siding with the tech community. Well, again, because there's growth potential there. And there is growth potential there because the real power of that collectivist element wasn't a political organization. It wasn't this thing called socialism, and it wasn't this thing called communism. It was fundamentally the information domain. And that information domain did not exist in any sort of functional, operational way until we got the internet. And since that time of getting the internet, we now have, as you can see, the rise of what's fundamentally collectivist companies. So the big companies that are winning big time during COVID-19 are Facebook and Amazon, and right. Just go to the NASDAQ and you see it's creating new highs basically weekly, and there you got some growth back. Right? You got a little bit of trouble, right, to deal with, right? Because you're, through the choreograph of COVID-19, and I'm just merely here talking about the choreograph, you are causing a lot of pain and suffering out there because, the way things had become is now subject to a certain amount of destruction. And that's very real. It's real for people's lives. In terms of, let's say, describing a context, the context that I'm describing here is, I think, a context of necessity, that the problem with the financial system has to be fixed, and the only way to fix it is through a rebalancing of that fundamental polarity, which has been basically dominated by industry, basically dominated by the Republicans, right? Dominated by whoever the Republicans represent in the whole power scheme, the whole military-industrial complex, so to speak. That's not Facebook. Why don't we just, having said that, give a little bit of mention here to kind of go beyond the choreograph of COVID-19 to just speculate a little bit about what is the actual causal factor causing the symptoms, which are obviously new kinds of symptoms in people, including a large number of deaths. And I certainly don't want to downplay any of that suffering because it's real human suffering. To ask, what is the causal factor? When I read the news about COVID-19, none of that news adds up, and it just doesn't make sense to me that the virus, so-called, would operate in the way that the news has been describing it to be operating. And beyond all the choreograph, beyond the media hyping the tests rather than the deaths, which is an important difference. Beyond all that, it seems to me that if you have a context like I'm describing it, if this context is the context, the proper context for understanding what is happening in COVID-19, then what you are going to want as a planner, wanting to implement through that context, is to control the reality on the ground. And the notion of a natural virus doesn't cut it for me in that sense. It's an arbitrary timing, etc. The notion of, let's say, a bioweapon virus, a virus that was, let's say, released, that doesn't really cut it either, because how are you going to control how it, to any sort of fine degree, how are you going to control how that virus works in society across the entire planet? I don't see that as a viable answer to the question of what's happening. Seems to me that if, and I'm no virologist, and I don't claim to understand the science of viruses, and neither do I think that the science of viruses isn't as bad as, let's say, the science of Einstein, which I think is a failure. It seems to me that the human body responds to new electromagnetic radiations that the body experiences initially through an immunological hit. And it seems to me that that this entire growth potential that the tech sector has is fundamentally reliant at least for its next stages, and that's what is wanted. What is wanted are the next stages of growth. That the tech sector is fundamentally reliant on getting up and running this new system of 5G, and so we've got like, I don't know how many thousands of satellites, shiny new satellites floating around, thousands or hundreds of thousands of relay towers on the ground that are all now transacting this brand new form of frequency, and it's a frequency that operates in the biological window. And it seems to me that there is a valid argument to be made that every time a new form of radiation like that, and we can go back to times when, let's say, houses were first electrified, because coming out of the walls, you're going to have some form of radiation that's going to be hitting the human person, including counterphased radiation, scalar radiation from the twisted wires. Or if you're talking, let's say, radar, where you've suddenly got military radar around the world firing all the time, and it seems to me that there has been an immune response by human beings each time a new form of radiation has been introduced. And it seems to me that 5G is fitting that bill quite precisely. I mentioned that 5G operates in the human biological window. Well, it's basically microwave frequencies. And if you just kind of do a little study about how a microwave oven works, what a microwave oven does, yes, it wants to cause the water inside the food to warm up, but even more than that, what it does is it vibrates at a cellular resonance, and it causes the cell to vibrate. And because it causes the cell to vibrate, the entire food warms up, and that includes, yes, warming up the water, but a microwave frequency is operating at the frequency of cellular resonance. And that's what 5G is. And if you're flipping the switch on, click, thousands of satellites, thousands, tens of hundreds of thousands, who knows how many there are. Are there millions? I have no idea. Of ground receivers, you're turning that system on. It seems to me a system like that operating in the biological window is going to cause a health hit. And so it seems to me that, society stepping into this 5G future that we're stepping into is a necessary step. And we could say, even just from a security standpoint, if we didn't do it and some other country did, they would be they would outdo us in terms of their informational capabilities, including their ability through gathering all the information that this whole system is going to gather, including their ability to drive development of AI, which is going to take over the entire informational sector, which could take over the entire world if there's a competition difference, such that everybody has to get in on the game of 5G. And because that's true, and because 5G operates in the human biological window, it seems to me that, even just from a security standpoint, that the entire system is necessary, including necessary from the vantage point of that security system wanting possibly to, do damage to somebody who is considered acting against the interests of the state or whatever, right? And if you have a frequency that operates in the human biological window, I think it's probably a lot easier to do that. So that surveillance through information is given real teeth, right? And if you were a security system saying, ask the question, do you want a system like that? Well, the answer is yes, right? So this whole step is a step of necessity, and it seems to me that it was well understood that turning the switch on, the go live event, was going to generate the kinds of health problems that we're actually seeing, subject to there being, let's say, particular targeting, which I don't think I'll go into here. I think it was well understood that there would be a health hit, and that those people in society with suffering immune systems that were in some manner not operating very well would suffer tremendously. I think that was well understood. And I think it's problematic that the entire system hasn't been responsible about that, if that's in fact the right explanation. But it certainly fits the entire context I've been describing. And it seems to me that given the necessity from all these angles, the necessity of the entire informational system being upgraded as it is, the necessity of the central banks needing to get some growth as they will, the necessity of transitioning into this kind of future where we are going to see actual kind of capitalism and communism as a foundational functioning in our society, where these two are not going to fight each other, but they're going to work in symbiotic cooperation, where we're going to have guaranteed basic income and AI and automated production that is going to kind of free people. Their heads are going to come above the water of survival, right? They're going to pass that threshold, and there's going to be a new future that people are going to be able to develop themselves in ways that they simply couldn't before, because they had to take care of the bills. They had to take care of that survival necessity. I had to go do that job, whatever that job was, even if it was completely arbitrary to my personality and preferences, right? And all of the anxiety and the fear that goes along with that kind of context. Well, that's just the natural anxiety and fear of a survival mode. And it's a great gift that this entire economy has brought us to bring us to a point where we can now take our first steps into a modality that is no longer based on survival, but is post-survival. That will give people freedom, and they're going to have to relearn how to live, basically, because, let's say 30 years from now, let's say we have guaranteed basic income, etc. Well, people are going to have to learn what to do with their time creatively, in what that means for kind of really what it means to actually live without living being dominated by just simply wolves chasing me and surviving that, right? I get to become the person I wanted to be. And that's an enormous gift that was brought to us by the capitalists, the monopolists, people like Rockefeller, etc. It was brought to us by offshoring to China, and China taking up basically the labor position of the world, where in taking up the labor position of the world, China inevitably drove those labor costs to a point of zero, because China is leading the trend to automate production. So China is going to give the gift of automated production from the labor party of the world. And that gift is an equal gift to the gift of the capitalists, who have basically funded through their efforts and designs that entire system. It's a dual gift. And stepping into that future, I think we are currently now crossing that threshold. And it has had to have come with this event that I'm describing as the COVID-19 event. And I think there's probably a 5G element there. I'm not certain, but it looks like it, if the shoe fits, and this shoe fits very, very well. Plus, I think we're looking into a kind of future where suppressed sciences can now come back into society, because one of the one of the gifts of this entire information system is a kind of surveillance, and I know people don't like hearing that, but if you have the kind of surveillance that this entire system allows, then you can create, there's potential for abuse, but you can create an extra measure of safety sufficient, in my opinion, to allow Tesla Sciences to come into operation with all the power that they represent. And for those who don't understand the power of Tesla technology, just kind of take a glance at 911. Weapons of mass destruction. You can destroy mass with Tesla tech. And you can create so-called anti-gravity propulsion with Tesla tech. So you get all those benefits. You can create medical interventions that intervene on the basis of waveform intervention, which is completely non-material, non-surgical, it has nothing to do with matter per se, with particles, but it's using the waveform representation of matter to bring an entire new class of health interventions, which will be surely tremendously effective when paired with kind of traditional means of doing medicine. The both of which form that natural polarity, only one of which is merely on its own destructive, which is, I think, what we've seen for the medical system as it currently exists with its material interventions, right? And its local causal understandings, all that stuff, right? So we're heading into that kind of future, and it's an enormous step. And I think, if I want people to go away with anything here, is to go away with a sense of the enormity of what is happening beneath our feet. That as a society, we have grown through the thousands of years. The last time, in my opinion, we were a functioning civilization was kind of before the previous cataclysm. Some people don't like the sound of those kinds of concepts. In any event, we have for thousands of years been crawling out of the mud, and in the last, let's say, couple decades, we have reached the point where we have succeeded, and we can now take a breath and go, as a society, as a civilization, go, oh, okay, the survival element is, so far as survival being within our control, is now within our control. That's an enormous event, and it portends a kind of change that is going to be with us for, must be at least 20 years, kind of getting into initial stages, where it's going to be major change all along. And so I think, people should buckle their seatbelts a little bit, because I think this ride's going to be is going to be pretty interesting, and it's going to be changing enormously. We'll wait until Tesla science gets out into the public and people realize that everything that they knew about the universe from a scientific vantage point was false. It's just simply not true that it takes a big body like a planet or a star to affect gravity. No, you can do it in the lab with electromagnetism. That's obvious. And so part and parcel of this change is that people are going to have to get comfortable with being uncomfortable, and to be comfortable with losing a lot of what they thought was previously the way things are, whether that was the way my life was, working in whatever kind of work or occupation, or whether that was my understanding of the way the universe works. All of that's going to swirl in the drain. And COVID-19 is kind of like the signature event, taking us through that in its initial phases. So I do think there is a necessary kind of respect that people should have for kind of what is happening, that it's not being played out in any sort of honest way, and that just drives me crazy, right? It's like Jesus Stop being so dishonest, everybody. Just start talking about real things in real ways that are actually honest. Apart from that, the reality is of what is happening is that the change is occurring. And I think people can come to some respect for that, despite the language that is being used, which is this bullshit language of all the media, right? Basically everybody. All the scientists, etc. So that's a big deal. And for my part, it's exciting. You know, we get to experience this. And this kind of transition, you know, how many generations ever get to experience something like this? And here we are in the middle of the funneling, rotating vortex, and we're in the center of it. So we get to experience an enormous change, and we get to experience what it means to change in a fundamental way, and including all the kinds of changes that I listed. You know, it's like my whole understanding is going to change. Let it change. And if I can give any sort of message to people who are feeling uncertain going through that, yeah, there's going to be tremendous uncertainty. It's all right. If you're feeling uncertainty, it's something you can deal with, because it's something that your entire system is actually transacting and dealing with. No problem. You can do it. It's trust yourself and trust this process as it leads into the future. It's going to be a better future, despite, you know, the natural tendency to think that people who have been lying to us have nefarious intent. Well, not necessarily. They do have a certain nefarious intent. Some of them maybe, yeah, sure. But in terms of the overall reality of what's happening, this planet wants a functioning human species. And there's no politician who's going to stand in the way of that. They can try, but they'll be, yeah, the planet has ways, right?